Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another session at the Media Rumble 2022. Today, this session will be around a working paper written by Shishir, Gupta, and Nandini Agnihotri from Center for Social and Economic Progress, New Delhi. The research paper is titled What Drives Media Reporting, and the working paper examines how and why the media covers certain topics more than others, by examining land-related conflicts around the country and corroborating these results with the coverage of the COVID-19 crisis and protests surrounding the farm bills. Shishir Gupta is a senior fellow and chief operating officer at Center for Social and Economic Progress. His work focuses on various aspects of Indian economy, ranging from economic growth, gender, urbanization, media, among others. Prior to this, he was working with the McKinsey Global Institute for 14 years. Nandini Agnihotri is a researcher at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. She studied economics from LSR, University of Delhi, and she has previously worked with ORF and UNDP. Her research interests span across areas of urban economics and political economy. I would kindly request Nandini to share her screen and begin with the working paper presentation.
So Prachi, first and foremost, thanks a lot for having us on this very prestigious platform. We are most thankful and looking forward to a good discussion, right? I think the first and foremost is to realize that media is critical. Media's role is critical, especially in a democracy, right? And while today it seems obvious to us, we are living in a digital age, its role was emphasized by none other than Amartya Sen almost 50 years back, right? When he was talking about how democracies prevent famines and starvation deaths, because democracies usually have a free press, which puts pressure on the government, right, to act, and then as a result, preventing deaths, right, because of famines, right? So I mean, now recognizing their importance, Nobel Peace Prize in 2021 was awarded to two journalists, Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov, right? I mean, so that is the extent to which media's importance is realized, and you can't get a bigger prize than this, right? And more recently, as we have seen, using technology, media is reporting the war in Ukraine from ground zero, right, and influencing public opinion the world over. So this is just to lay the background of why media is important and to what extent. Now, in this landscape, the complication comes when we move to how is media perceived in India, right? And there is a significant trust deficit between the people and the media in India, right? So only 38% of Indians trust most news, compared to 65% in Finland, 54% in Brazil, and 50% in Thailand. This is not to say that we are at the bottom, right? Because there are countries comparable to us, but we are definitely on the lower rung, right? And which basically indicates that there is significant trust deficit. Now, this low trust deficit is usually ascribed to media being either biased or influenced, right? Now, it comes naturally, this conclusion or inference, for an industry where 70% of revenue comes from advertisements, right, and only 30% odd from the actual subscribers. It is important to note that this 70% ad revenue, a large chunk of this actually comes from the government, right, both the center and the state. So when you put these together, and the inference is, well, media, the trust is low because media is either influenced or biased, right? Now, since we have talked about the importance of media and low trust deficit, that is why we got interested, right, in sort of understanding, is this true? What actually drives media reporting, as you laid out at the beginning, right? So this is a schema, right, to just help the viewers understand two distinct steps, right, between conflict, reporting, and impact, right? So there is a conflict or an event that occurs, which is reported by the media, and that as a result, some outcome happens, right? Now we are focusing in this study on the first leg, right, which is what actually, how the media decides what to report. I think so. That is the focus of our study. As we dug deeper into this, right, I mean, there we realized that there are three key drivers of media reporting, right? So the first and foremost is media gives more importance to issues closer to their readers. So as Nandini will talk about later in the paper, our focus here is on English media, and since English media is read mostly in urban areas, there is urban centricity in reportage by English media. Second is conflicts involving known people or corporates are covered more. Right? Now this is obvious. I mean, that is why celebrities, for example, are covered more. And the third one is that, I mean, among other things, that if a conflict has higher severity, right, people are unfortunately getting killed, right, for example, then that also drives coverage. I'll just stop and hand it over to Nandini, but it is important to realize that while 2 and 3 are obvious, which is the celebrity chasing type coverage and severity driven coverage, it is the first one, which is the media choosing to report issues closer to their readers. This is I think one of the fundamental drivers amongst these three, and is not as well understood, right? So I'll just stop here and hand it over to Nandini. Nandini, please carry on.
Yeah, thank you, Shishir. So there are two pathways or two pillars to our study. The first has to do with the occurrence of conflicts, and the second has to do with the media reporting of conflicts. For the occurrence of conflicts, the data set that we have used is from Land Conflict Watch, which basically gives a database of all ongoing land conflicts that involve communities. At the time of the paper, there were around 714 such conflicts that could be demarcated into having occurred in a rural area or an urban area. So in the occurrence of conflicts, we basically chart the urban-rural breakdown of where the conflict has occurred. Secondly, for reporting, the database that we have used is the Global Database of Events, Language, and Tone, which is a massive repository of all news reports. It collects all news reports from all across the world that you can access at any given point in time. And it gives that to you in a single database. It covers multiple languages, multiple topics, and also multiple countries. So we started off with this database to get an idea of media reporting of conflicts. The time period that we have used is 2015 to 2019. We have limited the scope of our study to this time period. And we study conflicts that have occurred, of course, only in India. So for media reporting, we started off with around millions and millions of news reports. We then had to go through all of them, filter them as per different themes of land conflicts, land acquisition, conflicts that violate people's rights over property, so that we end up with reports that are directly relevant to our study. We ended up with around 9,000 such reports. Post that, the process of filtering continued. We removed all duplicate entries, all irrelevant entries, and arrived at a list of 58 conflicts having occurred between 2015 and 2019. And these 58 then proceeded to make our idea of media reporting over conflicts. So firstly, of the urban-rural divide, when we map or chart the occurrence of conflicts with respect to the media reporting of conflicts, already you can see a great divide. So in the occurrence of conflicts, you can tell that 70% of the 714 conflicts had occurred in rural areas. Whereas in our list of 58, only 33% conflicts had to do with rural area occurring conflicts. So already we can see that there is a great divide between where a conflict occurs and what is actually reported in media. Building on our list of 58, we wanted to understand not only what is the urban-rural divide in our list of 58 conflicts, but also how deeply each single conflict is covered and what kind of media attention each individual conflict gets. So for that, we pick out a list of 7 conflicts from our list of 58 and do a deep dive and a more targeted study into these 7. These 7 are listed here on this chart. The x-axis of this chart, as you can tell, indicates the scale of conflict, which is an indication of the number of people potentially impacted. And the y-axis indicates the coverage received. So each of the red dot here is a rural conflict, and each gray dot here is an urban conflict. You can tell that on average, each rural conflict tends to have a higher scale of impact. It tends to affect more people, but it lies low on the coverage scale. While on average, each urban conflict tends to impact a lower number of people, but receives much more coverage, thus building even more on our urban-rural divide between occurrence and reporting of conflicts. So in order to stress test this and in order to understand whether this issue of an urban-rural divide runs deeper than simply land and property conflicts, we decided to study the COVID-19 induced oxygen shortage, which occurred in the second wave of the pandemic last year. So we studied tweets by 9 prominent media houses across a span of 2 months, April and May of 2021, which is when this crisis or this event was at its peak. In this chart here, the gray shaded area is an indication of all of the tweets in this time period that contain the word oxygen, and the red parts here indicate all of the tweets that contain the words Delhi as well as oxygen. So indicating that these were the tweets that were talking about the oxygen crisis in Delhi in some form or manner. Now, there are two things to note here. First is that of the total tweets in this approximately 2 months time period, Delhi makes up around 30% of this total, which is a disproportionate amount of attention given to any single metropolitan that makes up only about 1% of the total population of the country. The second thing to note here is that the overall trend of tweets that contains the word oxygen, that is the gray area, sort of follows the lead of the red area, and it peaks when the red area peaks and it fizzles out eventually when the conversation around Delhi dies down. Now, we corroborated this with news reports around the time, and we found that conversation around Delhi stopped on Twitter, according to these tweets, when the situation with respect to the oxygen crisis was being dealt with by the government, and the severity of this event was sort of dying down. But that is no indication of how things were going in the rest of the country, and other cities, big or small, could have been dealing with a more severe form of the oxygen crisis, or perhaps a less severe form. But it's interesting to note that regardless of whatever was happening in all these other cities, conversation died down when conversation around Delhi died down. This again corroborates our point that reporting is in fact deeply urban skewed. Now, as to the second point that Shishir pointed out, outside of the urban-rural divide, the second thing that tends to drive coverage is who is involved in the conflict. So here on the left, we see a conflict called the Manipur Bills, which had to do with the passing of certain bills in the state of Manipur that affected not only the identity of the people of the state, but also the rights that tribal groups would have over land in the state. People potentially impacted close to 2 to 3 million. This is a conflict that affected the largest number of people in our sample of 7. The coverage that you can see that it receives is around 22 news reports directly relevant and pertinent to this issue. Whereas on the right, we see a conflict titled Alibag Illegal Structures, which had to do with certain bungalows being built on the coastline of Alibag, which had to be demolished because they were flouting environmental norms. People impacted around 600 to 700, so a fairly small scale conflict compared to some of the others that we have seen. One interesting thing to note here is that one of the people involved in this conflict whose bungalow was demolished was Nirav Modi. And a lot of the coverage we noticed seemed to be driven around the fact that a famous person was involved. A lot of the news headlines had little to do with the actual conflict or the actual property issue, but had more to do with the famous person involved. And the coverage that it received is one of the highest in our sample, that is 50. So you can see that if the state and a community of people, however large, is involved, as it was in the Manipur Bills conflict, the coverage received would still be low compared to another conflict in which a famous individual or a famous corporation is involved. Now, thirdly, the severity of events also drives reporting. So, of course, a single conflict that is much more severe, involves acts of violence, protests, or riots will be reported much more. So this is a conflict that received the highest amount of coverage in our sample, that is the Thoothukudi copper plant conflict. So the severity itself can drive this coverage, can set to be driving this coverage. the fact that a famous corporation was involved could also have driven this coverage. But interestingly enough, even within this conflict, we see that the first event. So we broke down this conflict into a whole timeline of events and individually targeted each event to see how much reporting not only the conflict got, but how much reporting each single event in the conflict was getting. So you can see that the first event gets the maximum amount of coverage. The reports that are targeted towards reporting the first event are around 61 compared to 13 and 5 for events 2 and 3. And the first event had to do with a protest that unfortunately resulted in 13 people's death. So you can see that even within a conflict, an event that is of a very high severity involves violence, involves acts of protest, riots, as I stated earlier, would tend to receive much higher coverage. So now circling back to our first point, that is rural-urban divide in reporting. What might be driving this divide? Surely there has to be a reason why the media reports the way that it does. So we have established that the media reporting is in fact skewed towards urban issues. We find, and one can also logically deduce, that it's because the media industry caters to readers' interests, and perhaps the readers want to read more urban-centered issues. We find through our research that this, in fact, is because a lot of the readership of the media that we are studying, that is English language media, is located in urban areas. And therefore, people are more interested in what's happening in close proximity to them rather than something that might be happening in a distant setting. And therefore, since they want to read urban issues close to them, media houses therefore cater to this kind of readership and report more urban issues than rural. So English language media, approximately 40 million readers, it caters to around 40 million readers, whereas regional language media has, of course, a much broader reach. It caters to around 470 million readers. However, the English language media is concentrated, the readership for this media is concentrated in urban areas, whereas for regional language media is concentrated in more suburban areas or rural areas. An example of this is that in Mumbai, the most widely read dailies are 3 English language Times of India, Hindustan Times, and Mumbai Mirror. Whereas in the state of Maharashtra, in the entire state of Maharashtra, the 3 most widely read dailies are 3 regional language newspapers, Lokmat, Daily Sakal, and Pudhari. This is true for other states as well. This is true for multiple states wherein a single metropolitan or a big urban hub, an urban area, would have much higher readership for regional language media or more vernacular language media. Shishir, would you like to continue?
Yeah, thanks, Nandini. So I think there are, what does it all mean, right? Basically, we drew 3 big inferences from this, right? One is that media is like any other industry, right? So it has, among other things, it has to cater to what the readers want to read, right? And the simple point is, in this case, we analyze English media. And as we just saw, English media is concentrated in urban areas. So that is why you see urban centricity, right, in English media coverage. Now, this has, to our mind, has one profound implication, right? That even in an ideal world with no influence, bias whatsoever, right? The fact coverage by media will never be perfectly representative, right? Simply being that the readers differ, right, for different types of media, right? So this is, to my mind, one of the most profound things, right, that we need to understand and communicate, right? And I am very, very glad that you at newslaundry have picked up this paper, because I think this message needs to be understood, right, and communicated. And the third thing is, for this has its significant implication, right, for the governments, both at the center and the state, which is to not rely on a limited or one source of truth, right? Because that there is a high chance that it will be impacted or representing the interests of a small group who happen to be the readers of that particular media, right? So this is important, right? Coming back to our example on Delhi oxygen shortage, if the government had to rely only on tweets, etc., of those 9, then by that, given that the tweets, etc., had died down by May end, essentially one can infer that the oxygen situation had improved in the country as a whole. So this is just a word of caution, right, for the governments to sort of not rely on limited sources of truth. I'm not saying they do or they don't do. I mean, ultimately, we are economists, so we are entering into a media territory which is not our domain. But this comes as an inference, right, from the paper. Nandini, you want to talk about it?
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much to News Laundry for, as Shishir said, picking up this paper and this important issue. Our presentation today was based on a working paper that we published earlier this year, which you can access on the website of our organization. That is the CSEP website. And if you're interested, then you can access our working paper and read the rest of our findings and our methodology on the website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nandini and Shishir. So following up on the presentation, I will pose a few questions. So when you speak about how newsworthy content is decided by the media, generally the general perception is that the event has to be of a larger scale and then it needs to impact a lot of people. So in case of the Manipur bills that you talked about, the conflict had a lot of people affected, but the coverage was less. So do you think this directly relates to the geography of the media outlets situated there as well, given that most of the media organizations are based around the urban spaces? For example, to give example of cities, like they are based on metro cities and their extent of coverage does not really reach the rural audience. So the proximity of the bureau also directly corroborates with why the conflict is not really reported.
Yeah, so that could very well be the reason, not only the fact that people are interested in urban issues and they're situated in urban areas, but also the fact that urban houses and media houses themselves are situated in urban areas. I think this also leads to an interesting question as to why prominent media houses would want to be settled in urban areas in the first place, which in turn could mean that the whole logic comes full circle and they are in urban areas because that's the readership that they cater to. So that actually could very well be true, that they themselves also have a physical domain of theirs, and they also cover what's in close proximity to them. So that being said, in terms of other kinds of media houses, say regional media or vernacular media that might not be situated in urban areas, might be situated in other areas, do tend to cover conflicts that are not urban centered and have a different kind of a perspective and outlook in what they cover. So this divide could also be stemming from where the media houses are situated. Shishir?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if one were to do this study at a global scale, right? For example, right, I mean, there is probably the worst humanitarian crisis going on in living memory in Yemen, right? Do we care about it? We don't, right? And that is why it is not talked about in our media, right? I mean, I'm just giving that as an example, right, of how what we want to read drives what we get to read, right?
So just building on that question as well. So given the ownership patterns in the media directly relates to the trust that the reader has as well. So profit-driven media generally that relies on advertisers that you'd mentioned, like 70% of the industry gets its revenue from advertisers. Given that legacy media relies largely on advertisements, do you think they report on certain issues because they need to maximize their reader revenue? So cases such as the Alibag case which got maximum number of coverage. So do you think that directly relates to profit-driven models?
So see, that is I think to say it differently, ultimately media exists because there is a need for people to know about what's going on, right? and they need to know, and then what gets covered is driven by what people want to read. I mean, that is the whole crux of this paper, right? So now, how some news, some conflicts are covered more versus less. We talk about those three drivers, right? I mean, which we have talked about, right? That it is not just the severity, right? It is also who's involved and the proximity of the readers to who's the where the reader lies versus who's the intended audience for the group, right? Now, frankly speaking, if I put an economist hat on this question, right, given that there is heterogeneity of readers, by location, by interest, etc., I think there must be a lot of white space for a lot more different types of media to understand that some aspects which are important for some other group are not covered as much, right? And if they target that audience, then they can make money by covering their issues, right? And so that is how I think industries evolve, right? By sensing the white spots, right, and filling that gap. And I see media as being no different.
Building on that question, so if I were to pose a question stating that if you look at alternative media outlets like newslaundry, wherein we focus on issues depending on how important those are, not like it's quality rather than quantity. So given if the model of revenue is to change for the media, do you think the way that reporting happens on certain topics will evolve in the days to come, when you are not answerable to the advertisers but to the readers?
So it's a tricky one, and this is not something that we have studied as part of the paper. So with that caveat, if I were to again think aloud, right? See, the litmus test is whether this new revenue model serves a legitimate need for the readers, right? Because ultimately you need to earn revenue, right, to pay your bills and pay your costs, right? And so if readers feel that, well, they are getting something different, something better from initiatives like the News Laundry, then you will have this model evolve, flourish, right? But if they feel that this probably is not what they want to follow, subscribe, or whatever, then I don't see, right? So it is again, the fundamental question is, what is the need that you are serving and who's your audience, right? And that is how markets work, and to my mind, that is how media is part of the market, right? I mean, it is an industry where market forces work, to my mind. It is not an industry where there is a inherent market failure.
Yeah, and I think just adding to that, so in a hypothetical universe where media houses are not answerable to their advertisers, their funders, or whatever word we use for them, but instead to their readers, I think one point that we make through the paper is that in a world without any biases, there would still not be perfect media reporting, because media houses would still be answerable to their readers and what the readers want. So there would always be this, as long as a relationship exists between the readers and between news houses and the news that they serve, I think there would continue to be some kind of a skew in terms of what is reported. The skew could be driven anywhere depending on what the audience is and what the audience wants. But I think there would still be some underlying, the news would not be 100% objective, because all news would cater to some kind of an audience setup.
And I think that's a critical point. Thanks, Nandini, for bringing it up. By skew, we don't mean that you are doing it or anyone doing it intentionally, right? The whole thing is that ultimately you have to report something that your readers want, and readers are not readers don't want exactly the same thing, right? So that is what the notion of skew here, right?
So we have a long way to go in terms of the media industry, I believe. I had one more question building on the report. So given that there is the COVID crisis that you extensively studied. So you said that the tweets die down after a certain period of time. So given during the second wave. So does that also directly relate to like the coverage fatigue that the media faces when covering a longer duration of any sort of happening or a conflict? So you also built up on the example of Yemen. It is a humanitarian crisis that has been going on for a decade, I believe. It's been so long, but then the coverage is maximizes when there is a very big occurrence that happens, and then suddenly it dies down as well. So in the case of the second wave as well, there was maximum number of tweets were done when the crisis was surging. So do you think like the coverage fatigue that the media faces in terms of following a certain topic that goes on for a long duration, so does that also add up to the report?
So let me take a stab and then pitch in. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So I think there are multiple layers to your question, as I understand, right? One is that if there is a longer duration conflict, right, you would cover it when there is some distinct event happening, right? Because otherwise, again, if I am reading it and if I see daily the same thing, but not much is happening, I am not interested in it, right? As a reader, I am not interested. That is why the news houses or media houses will not cover it, right? So that is the first layer, right? The second layer, more specifically to the oxygen shortage case study that we have done. Actually, the point there is that it is because of urban centricity of English media that once things seem to have stabilized in Delhi, the picture that one gets, if that was the universe of truth, right? The picture that would have emerged was that oxygen situation had stabilized in the country as a whole, which may or may not have been true, right? Given that we know that COVID infections first typically start off from big cities and then trickle down to smaller cities and villages. So one inference could be that oxygen situation may still have not been resolved in the country. But if you looked at how it was covered, and if that was your source of truth, then you would have then it would have resulted in suboptimal policy response, right? But Nandini, anything that you would like to add to this question that Prachi posed?
Not really. I think, Shishir, you covered it. The one important thing to note in our COVID-19 case study is not simply the fact that tweets died down, but the coincidence with which the tweets around Delhi died down and the overall tweets died down. I think, as Shishir said, a logical inference to make from that is overall tweets were in some form or manner perhaps driven by tweets around Delhi. But in our overall study as well, because you're right, coverage fatigue or however one names it is a thing, especially with regard to land conflicts that go on for almost years and years, if not decades in some cases. Which is why we broke down each conflict into multiple events and studied reports around these specific events. So that news reports aren't just about, say, the building of the bullet train and land acquisition with regards to that, but about each single act of acquisition and each single policy lapse surrounding it. So just so we account for this fatigue and don't miss out on any nuance of reporting.
But I just want to bring in 30 seconds, right? I mean, this. So media, for example, is a lot of times sort of, I don't know the right word, but accused of not following up on critical conflicts that affect country or the world, right? One of the things is that they move on to new stories, right? And again, if you look back and if you step back, the reason why they do is because at a fundamental level, that is what as a reader I want to read. I don't want to read the same thing if nothing new is happening in that, right? So I think that is, again, I just want to reinforce this whole importance of what readers want to read and media reacting to it, as opposed to media acting in isolation, right? I mean, so
Because I think it's a two-way road the reader and the media industry has to go through.
Yeah.
So just building on, I think, on the expansion of the report. So this report currently looks at only urban-centered English language newspapers. But given the diversity in the country and the readership as well, if we were to extend this report to like vernacular languages and regional languages, like you mentioned in the case of Maharashtra, how there is a difference in number of readerships of the local languages dailies as well, do you think we would be able to find like an alternative form of reportage in terms of local conflicts? Because given their proximities to the local audience, will they be doing more justice to reporting conflicts that happen around the area in comparison to the English language dailies centered around urban cities?
I think as an inference, I would say yes. That seems like a natural inference. Also, that is something that in our conversations with senior journalists who helped us think it through, that seems to be the general consensus, right? That there is difference in reportage because the audience is different, right? So I would say yes. In fact, that to me is a natural extension. And another interesting thing to do would be, I don't know how to do, but how do governments digest so many different views, so many different media into deciding what they ultimately choose to decide? Nandini, you want to add something to this?
Yeah, so as Shishir mentioned, in our many conversations with journalists and people who are involved in and work with the media, there is a clear difference in how English media reports and how regional language media or vernacular media reports. Vernacular media gives much more space to these kinds of conflicts that affect large communities of people. And also in how it reports, it reports these conflicts in greater nuance. So there's definitely a difference in perspectives of how English language media handles its issues and regional language media handles its issues. We could not, as a part of this study, study all the regional languages or even some because of our own limitations in terms of understanding all of the nuances or even understanding the languages, honestly. But I think it is a natural extension of the paper too, because people in different, say, suburban or rural areas who are much more directly impacted by conflicts and crises such as, say, land acquisition for an urbanization project would want to read about the developments in such conflicts. And therefore, it falls on the media houses to, again, cater to what the readers may want. So again, you're building on all of these inferences. It is true that there is a difference between how different language-based media houses report.
Thank you so much. So I think with this question, this is the end of our session. And I would like to thank you for writing such an important paper, given the context around how the media is reporting all sorts of crises in the world. And also that this report highlights the accountability that the reader also has in terms of trying to see like, what content they want to access and want to read. So I would like to conclude by saying this, that it's a two-way street and both the reader and media should also be held accountable. And thank you so much for writing this paper and joining us for the Media Rumble. Thank you so much, Prachi, again, for giving us this opportunity. I would just like to end by saying that as is standard with think tanks, these views expressed and the findings of the paper are basically ascribed to Nandini, me, and our alum Sikkim, and not to the organization, right? So, but thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All the best, Prachi, with the Media Rumble this year.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
We'll send you an official invite closer to the forum dates, and we'd love to see you there. And also,
absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks.